So, jobs to be done is a way of seeing. We like to think of it as a broad perspective, a lens through which you can see the people that you serve and what their needs are. It's not necessarily a single method or approach. Of course, we all owe something to Clayton Christensen, who popularized the term, but he never really had a specific method. So what we end up with are these different flavors of jobs to be done. And we've tried to embrace those different flavors. Of course, here at the Jobs to be Done Toolkit, we have a method that we put forward, but we recognize that jobs to be done is really a way of seeing. And we're going to talk about some of those different perspectives and different techniques and things that you can do with jobs to be done in this episode of Jobs to be Done Untangled. My name is Jim Callback. I'm the author of the Jobs to be Done playbook and the co-founder of the Jobs to be Done Toolkit.
Yeah, and I'm Elaine Matthias. I am the other co-founder of the Jobs to be Done Toolkit, and we're over here curating and creating resources to help you put jobs to be done in action in your everyday work. And so that's one of the things that we're doing here today with Jobs to be Done Untangled. This is our monthly community event. It occurs on the last Tuesday of every month at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And as you probably noticed in the beginning of the call, we get a lot of repeat attendees. Love seeing everybody's faces. We are going to go through a couple of housekeeping items for today, introduce our guest speaker. Jim and Beth will have a presentation and a little bit of a talk, and then we'll have some time for an open conversation and questions at the end. So on the housekeeping front, we have our popular Applying the Core Process mini course coming up in mid-June. That's the 16th, 18th, and 20th. It's 2 hours each day, conveniently timed over lunch. And we give you a great overview of the entire core process of jobs to be done. So we'll go from beginning to end using a really standardized method that Jim has developed and help you get the whole picture through interactive activities, conversation. It's very little lecture and a lot of hands-on. You can also work with Jim. He offers team coaching. So if anybody is interested in having him come in, give you some guidance, take a look at what you're doing and give feedback, all kinds of different ways that you can connect with Jim and get feedback on what you're doing or answer any questions that are really specific to maybe the context that you're working in, and dive deep with him and get a better understanding of sort of how to see the space that you're working.
Oh, yeah. And I'd love to work with any or all of you. But today it's not about me. It's about our guest. It's about Beth McHugh, the founder of Tilta Consulting. Hi, Beth. Thanks for joining the call today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited
Welcome.
to dig in.
Yeah. Welcome to the community.
I know I hadn't heard of it before, so I'm excited to have it on my calendar for future events too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We have great conversations here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with the group. As Elaine mentioned, Beth has a few points that she wants to go over, but if you have any questions, please put those into the chat because we're going to facilitate hopefully a nice discussion afterwards. But Beth, why don't you kick it off and tell us a little bit about yourself? If you want, I can stop sharing my screen if that
Yeah,
helps.
yeah. I'll bring. I got some slides I just typically use, so let's
Yep.
get this up there. I got to move you all over, and what is that? All right. How's that looking? Good.
Good. Yeah, we got you.
So yeah, just to introduce myself, Beth McHugh. I founded Tilta Consulting about 3.5 years ago. I started doing customer discovery in 2006. And when I started at a startup called LearnZillion, it's ed tech, I just recognized that none of the tools that I had been using were working really well. And that's where I discovered Jobs to be Done. I brought that to the product to develop a product strategy, and it did sell, which is kind of a check off the box of startup. And I've been using that ever since. That was about 10 years ago. Today, I help early stage and growth companies discover these core customer problems. And just some fun facts. I like the name Tilta. I'm half Swedish, and so it means to grow in strength. Is one of my little fun facts. But when I first got into Jobs to be Done, I did start with Tony Ulwick's work, and I didn't recognize that there were other people. So I love, Jim and I have started collaborating a little bit because I think he sees it in the way I do, that it is a toolkit. There's a lot of different approaches. And so I am going to dig into an approach that you may or may not have heard of, that is Bob Mesta. And he so he has an approach that I tend to use and default to, especially when people don't have clear hypotheses. But as Jim was saying, everything's built on the same type of theory that Clay Christensen popularized about people hiring products to make progress in their lives. It is this different lens, this different way of thinking about it. But so there's the milkshake story. If you guys are familiar with the milkshake story, if not, it's in Clay Christensen's book. He talks a lot about it. And it's how they kind of recognized through interviews and talking to people about milkshakes, like they were taking surveys and trying to say, do we put more toppings on it, make it thicker, make it thinner? And they changed that lens to a jobs to be done lens and wondering why people hire it. What situations and contexts were they buying those milkshakes? And they recognized there was a milkshake, cluster that was about the morning commute and wanting something that keeps them entertained, keeps them full till lunch. And then there was another cluster that was the after school milkshake of the kids. And so if you look at some fast food restaurants, there's that separation between like a McCafe and that dessert. And that kind of came from this different lens of looking at it. It's not about the toppings. It's not about the thickness. It's about what people are trying to accomplish. So I like to use a example of Uber. It just seems relatable to everyone. So you can ask people about their Uber experience. What would you like to be better about Uber? And you might hear about, do you want to talk to the driver? Maybe half of them didn't want to talk to them. And you start to get this feedback that's really hard to sort through. You might even split it up by demographic and think you're gone to something. And it kind of feels a lot like that milkshake story that you get toppings and thickness and thin, and you're kind of cycling and don't really recognize what can help us move forward and really get more customers and get people using our product more. And really, I see jobs to be done as taking that step back, that you are that is based off context and scenario. So you might take an Uber when you're commuting to work. You might use it as seeing some sights as a tourist. You might need to use it in getting to the hospital in emergency, and you have different needs based off of that context and scenario. So Jim and I are using an example of commuting to work in another way, but I like using this example because if you start to talk to people about commuting to work, you might uncover these different things that are coming up around incorporating exercise. That's why they're using a bike or walking. Maybe they take the train, even though the car might be easier for them, but they want to be more prepared so they're able to work on the way to work. Or they're hiring Uber Black because they want to look professional. They have a social job that they're trying to accomplish. So when you think about that lens, it just opens up these new ways of recognizing it's not just about commuting to work. It's about all these other needs that they have and jobs that they want to accomplish. So, Jim said this before, there's a lot of different approaches. Jim's book's on here, which I do love because it is about a toolkit. But there's a lot out there. And that actually confused me when I first got into it because I knew Jobs to be Done as just Tony Olwick's book. And I thought that was Jobs to be Done. And then people would start talking about a different framework. And I felt like I was so confused, like they're using different language, they're using different ways of thinking about it. And so what I've started to do is talk a lot about the different approaches and start to unpack that because I find there's value in a lot of different ones. And the two main practitioners I like to call the demand side of things, which is Bob Mesta, or the outcomes side of things, which is Tony Olwick. And when I think about using these approaches, this is my personal opinion, so others may feel differently, but I find Bob Mesta's way is when there's not this certainty around like the job. So, you're not sure whether the commuting to work is really what you want to dig into, or you're feeling stuck and needing this fresh perspective. You're just kind of going in circles versus with Olwick, like the job is a little bit more known. You want like not the job to be done, but the job like area is a little bit more well known. You want to understand those biggest opportunities and drilling into it. And I think these are the two big practitioners. I think there's a lot of variations on this, which I love. Like I love Jim's work that I find is approachable, like an approachable way for Tony Olwick, but more collaborative. And you can, I think you agree with this, Jim, because we've talked about that.
I do.
There's like Clement, which is that kale and coffee, which I find is more like Bob Mesta, but is more theory. There's not practitioner. Mike Boyson does a lot with Ulwick and is a lot more AI powered. So you'll start to see there's a lot of different slants and like people leveraging it for different ways. But I like to draw it back to these two main practitioners. I won't get too much into this. Well, I guess we're going to get into Bob Mesta's way, but if you hear things like switch interviews, and Jim brings this up in his book, The Four Forces, that's kind of what's different about his way. You cluster. Oops, I have a typo because I, of course, did something right before this call, but that's supposed to say John, not John's to be done. But there's a different approaches that you can use to dig into this. So I'm going to go through that today. So if folks aren't familiar with Bob's perspective, that's what we're going to be digging into. So he was actually a close collaborator with Clay on that famous Milkshake story. He was kind of the guy behind the scenes. And his two main books that I love to reference, The Demand Side Sale is kind of the intro to the approach. And then he does have the Jobs to be Done handbook. I will say it kind of falls off a cliff at the end. I've told Bob this himself, but it doesn't quite get to like the full analysis part of it. But it's a great way to talk about how you interview this way, how you pull out the four forces, which again, I'm going to walk through. So from Bob Messa's perspective, this is from his Demand Side Sales book. How he describes what a jobs to be done is you have this struggling moment. You have this new way that you want to get to. I like to talk about the, going to the gym. You want to like maybe have your summer body, and you have this idea of like, I want to do this. I really want to get to this goal, but there's something in the way that's getting you there. And that is that struggling moment. And you want to make this progress, but you're really struggling to get to that new way of whatever you're trying to do. So that applies to, B2B and like your daily life. I now see it and I post about just things that happen on my daily life too, for this gap. And those move, I forgot. What's really at play are these four forces. You have the situation that you're in. I like the summer's coming up, like I'm going to be at the beach. And so you kind of have these pushes. I have a gym that's advertising something. It's kind of pulling me in that direction, things that will get me towards that new way. But then there's all these things that are pushing me away from making that change. So maybe I feel like I have all the motivation to work out 5 times a week. I signed up for a gym, and so now I have a gym that's going to pull me in that direction. But then maybe you have anxiety about showing up at a gym, or you don't have good clothes for it. You have these habits that just you keep slipping and not making that workout happen. You keep sleeping in, hitting your snooze alarm. And so how Bob approaches this is that if you look and analyze these different forces, then that starts to uncover these struggle moments and what are those jobs to be done that can help get people over the hump. So any questions so far? Because I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but we'll play with it too and do a little exercise. I can't see.
I don't see. Brett has a question about the context of the commuting job. Do people hire a job for the commute generally, or hire a commute and select a job based on that?
Hire a job. So can you say that one more time?
I think Brett, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're asking is how do you frame the notion of commuting as a job? Are you hiring, like in that instance, is it how you're actually performing the commute? Or do you start with the commute and then select a job as say like a branch out of that? Like I'm commuting and I need something to eat for breakfast at the same time.
So when I think about what job you're accomplishing, like this is a functional job that you need to get to work. And so I would think of the like needing to eat as a different job to be done. So I would see those as two different types of jobs. What I'm talking about in this specific instance is you can start with the functional job of commuting to work. And when you are digging into that, you might recognize other jobs that are contextually related to that. So you might uncover like that exact example that there is another job that is related to this about eating on the way to work, like getting eating on the way to work. Jim, you want to chime
Yeah,
in?
no, I think that's exactly it. Is at least, yeah, and this is the way that Elaine and I teach as well too, is that the big functional job is just a way to frame it. Is just a way to say, in this space we're looking at commuting to work, but then there's going to be all these flavors and what we call differentiators or factors that differentiate getting to work, right? And then I think the task there is to be able to isolate and compartmentalize those things, like the exercise versus, preparing, right? And then you can start to prioritize as well too. But that the big commuting to work is really just a way to frame the space that you're investigating. That's the way that I see it, Brett.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for that. And I will say that I think the starting point is a big difference between Ulwick's approach and Bob's approach with how to uncover these jobs to be done in the focus area. I think I talk about it briefly here, but with Bob Mesta's way, you're actually recruiting more around this decision that someone has made, and you're not really sure exactly which job they are necessarily wanting to accomplish. Whereas Ulwick, I think you start with the job of like commuting to work, and you start uncovering it from there. So there's a bit of a difference in like the starting point
Mhm.
for these two different approaches that that I think can change the way that you're thinking about the job and the starting point.
I don't want to derail your brief, so I'll push to the back because I want to peel that onion, but not right now.
Need a follow up. I can geek out on this all the time. But I will say I think that was part of the confusion too, is sometimes for me was the different ways that things are talked about and the different approaches. So I also think we could probably take that question and talk about it more from one approach versus another approach's perspective too. All right, so back to the four forces of progress. So these are the main components of Bob Mesta's way of thinking about jobs to be done. There's this general thinking of like the struggling moment and wanting to get over the hump and making progress towards that goal. The second one is these four forces. And then the third one is the timeline, which I find similar to like a job map that you think about, the journey. So there's some shared things of different approaches that are just called different things. But when you're doing the interviews, the timeline is also important about like these key events that move you from a first thought to a passive looking. So there is overlap in the different approaches with something like a timeline. Like you're zooming out and thinking about what are the steps that they're taking, not just, their interaction with your product. And another thing that's talked about a lot is this idea of causal mechanisms and digging deeper. And I think this, relates to a lot of different ways that you're doing customer discovery, but you're digging deeper to get down at the causes. Bob likes this phrase, and excuse my French a little, but he says, bitchin' ain't switching. So like you can have these problems and symptoms, but like you need to have underlying causes that are really driving you to get to make action and take action and make a decision. So quick, just story around, I applied this approach to a mental health app startup. So as a founder, they had a whole pitch deck around this mental health app for a particular segment of audiences with a specific mental health disorder. And so she didn't have customers. So you're not recruiting customers, you're actually recruiting people who made a decision in this realm. So they made a decision about mental health. It's enough of a problem that they want to take action on that they have made a switch. So we recruited people who had gone to therapy, had hired a therapist or had been working with a mental health app to help them manage this mental health disorder. And once we started talking to them, I think it was about 3 interviews in, the founder said, I need to change my pitch deck completely because they were approaching it as if the consumer would be buying this app, but it was super clear from going through all the journeys, and we did, 4 more interviews, that they weren't the one that was going to make this switch and jump over that struggle point, that there was a reliance on their employer, their the healthcare provider, especially with this particular mental health condition. Like, they typically didn't have a job or forms of payment, and it made her really rethink how she was positioning the app. And she actually talked to someone that week and said that they pitched a similar idea to 100 investors and found out the same thing. So I think there's such a power in jobs to be done when you are talking about that journey and the insights that you can get from it versus spending all the time building something or pitching an idea that's not going to be viable. Okay, so now what are we on time? Okay, 13 minutes. So now I'd love to show, and I can share this link around. There's a lot of these interviews that Bob, and this is Chris, who they head up a Rewired group, but they have these videos that I love watching because you can start to watch how the interviews actually happen. Let me send this in the chat. So don't click on this. I don't yet, but if you want it to copy it and view it on your own time, the whole video, I'm going to share a clip because the way that jobs to be done interviews happen with Bob's way is, I find, slightly different. One, you are recruiting people who have made a switch in some realm, and then the way that you're trying to pull out these forces in the timeline, I find a bit different than the way that you do interviews for like Tony Owick's type approach, because it's all about these switch moments and the decisions around those. So I'm gonna play a few minutes of this interview for you guys to listen to.
Your bar's really low, guys. All right. So when did you have the first thought that you needed a car? Like,
so I was using a car rentals or car sharing, like a Zipcar, and like renting cars when I need them longer. And I really, really didn't want to buy a car. I used to own a car, so I was always pushing against it. And my wife wasn't against owning one, but she wanted to have one. So we had a baby, and my wife was on maternity leave for a year. And I was like, well, someday in the future, we're probably going to need a car. But I had friends who had kids and they didn't have cars. So I was like, let's hold out as long as we can. And so this is one of those things where you're just in your mind is like, don't want anything to do it. I don't want to maintain a car. So you're literally pushing it out of your mind. Yeah. And I think what made me finally go, okay, we'll start looking at cars, was because we were using like Zipcar or renting a car. Sometimes it would just be easier to use. My wife's family lives like an hour outside of Toronto. And you take these like commuter trains, and she missed the commuter train once, and they only came once an hour. And she was on a commuter train platform with a 6-month-old in the winter in Toronto for an hour. I was like, I would murder someone if I was in her scenario. So I was like, okay, let's start looking for a car.
So it wasn't that it happened to her. It was the fact that you didn't want it to happen to you.
I was like, the fact that I don't want to buy a car, like just stranded my wife on a platform with my 6-month-old son. It's bad enough for that, but the notion is like,
well, wait, let's not. What was the conversation with her? Was this like, you've been keeping me from buying a car? And
no, not at all. She was like, I was angrier about the scenario. I was like, oh my God, the stupid GO train, they can't run trains on time. She was just like, oh, Edison didn't, he was in good behavior and blah, blah, blah. So it wasn't a big deal.
Edison's your son?
Yeah.
What's the name of your wife?
Oriole.
Oriole.
I told her last night that I was like, yeah, these guys might interview me. So she's like, okay, whenever you refer to me as your stunningly beautiful wife.
Perfect. on the record.
There's one other scenario that
the time of
like
when was the born?
June 26th of 2012.
Okay. So the year isn't up yet.
No, No.
So at this point in time, it's like it's February somewhere. When was she stranded? What was the date she was stranded?
I think it must have been like early January.
Early January. So you had
Early January, maybe late December, something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Like definitely winter time.
Yeah. But it wasn't so soon. Literally, you took 6 weeks, 8 weeks to find a car still.
Yeah.
So how often was she going to her parents?
Well, like I'm sure we probably went like every week or two, but then there's like a mishmash of like, so like I found like a really good enterprise dealership near our place. So they would pick up and drop off a car. So like renting a car from them wasn't that bad. And then like Zipcar, like I would just be like, okay, well if I gotta pay like a daily rate from them, I just will, or like get a lift into Hamilton with her sister or something like that. So there's like a mishmash of solutions, right?
Was that the last time she took the train, or was the train out at that point, or?
You know, it might have been a lot. Like she might have taken it maybe one more time. I don't think I've ever taken the GO train since then.
Okay, since then it was like out.
Well, it's just like
I think it's going to take a little longer to get to the second scenario, but I'll just explain. The second scenario was they went to IKEA, and he recognized that like the Zipcar was working for a little while. But then they went to IKEA, and it takes like 4 hours to just do IKEA because with the son, he's not sure how long it's going to take them. They might, have to change a diaper, and then they're exhausted on the way back, and then they have to still return the car. And so it's uncovering these moments in these stories. And I think you could hear from Chris and Bob, like they were trying to get this timeline. They're trying to understand, when did this happen? Okay, there's a gap here. Let me dig into this area and understand like what was happening between this and this decision point to get to like what was the thing that finally put him over the edge to buy a car. Like he was hanging on for so long, not buying a car, but what was that, all these contextual mechanisms, I like to call them, like of what was happening to get them over the edge of buying. And so I've shared the link. I think it's a great interview to watch. And I think they go through the forces. If not, a lot of his other interviews, they go through and pull out these 4 forces of that situation. So you recruit 7 to 10 people who have bought cars, and you want to kind of get a variation of people who have purchased some type of car, but you don't really know what your hypothesis is around buying these cars. So they pull out these 4 forces, like what was pushing him and this pain and this frustration in that direction. I don't know if anybody wants to try to chime in on this, or I can give some answers. Anybody from what you saw? It was a much longer interview, but like what was pushing him towards this future way?
So my take is threefold. One is there's a need now to have their own schedule as opposed to before. Mm-hmm. Secondly, they're toting around the papoose now, which changes the dynamics of, where you can be. And third is they're buying different things than they were just when they were just the two of them. Mm-hmm. So, the vehicle itself, the question I put in the chat was there's a cultural piece in here that prevented them from owning a car in the first place. Mm-hmm. Maybe situation, but probably cultural, that is now causing them to, obviously they're not against cars because they drive the Zipcar, but mm-hmm. clearly, whereas before apparently that was convenient, now it isn't, because they're making different purchasing choices, which the vehicle is an important part of. So yeah. I'm trying to figure out the job here. Is the job to transport, or is the job to own your schedule?
So great point. So I'm not going to go through the whole exercise here, and you also, you do this for each interview and then you kind of pull them all together. But what they were trying to pull out were, okay, this timeline, what were those key events that were happening, that got them from first thought, like he said, there's someday I know I'm going to have a car because of this baby. The baby like came, and they like know that they need this car, but he's not actively looking or deciding. Like there's an event that happens that gets him over here. And I think from that interview, there's like the passive looking, like he's starting to think about it more because his wife got stranded on the train. And then he goes from passive looking to active looking because of that IKEA like the IKEA trip of like, this is becoming like such a nightmare. So in Bob's approach, you map out the timeline. In the interview, you try to like suss out those key events that are happening because you start to get those clues about what is pushing them in the right direction. So you map out these 4 forces. So the push is having a baby and like having to transport with this baby, like these situations of when I'm commuting to visit my parents, when I'm going to IKEA. You pull out the benefits of like this new thing of not having to, go rent a zip car, of not having to get stranded, like you're kind of on your own time. Those are the pools of this new way and this decision. And then the habits, I think what you were talking about, like the cultural habit, like he has a habit of walking to work, not using a car. And so like that's the way it's always been done. Like let's keep doing it. Like he would keep doing that if these things of having a baby, getting stranded, yeah, awful IKEA run, wouldn't happen. So pull out the 4 forces, get to key struggle moments, and then and I did this with, the mental health app. I'm doing this with an ed tech app right now, with an acquisition, but I like this example because it has a video related to it. But then you're taking like, you do 7 interviews like that, and you start looking at the pushes and the pulls, and you'll start to see kind of these clusters. And, I didn't do 7 interviews here, but you start to pull together like, hey, these are new parents that need this more reliability. And developing a job to be done statement. So I think there's lots of different formats of jobs to be done statements. And I think this follows the general rule of thumb. The one thing that I've is added in from Bob's perspective is this I struggle to part of it, which I think can be powerful because it can sense that like I'm actually going to make a change. It's not like bitch and hate switching, that you are, you're really struggling with this, and so you have the motivation to make a change. So I have not done 7 interviews to like start to see what the themes are across multiple stories, but my attempt at the jobs to be done statement for that interview. So when I become a new parent and I struggle to coordinate reliable and convenient transportation with a baby, help me transport my family. So it doesn't talk about car buying like you are transporting your family, because that enterprise worked for a little while. Like there was another solution that was not buying a car, so that I can avoid delays and feel like a good husband. There was also that part where he talked about like feeling terrible that his wife was, stranded, that he was doing that to his family, and he was frustrated. So then you start clustering around that, and then these are the jobs to be done that you can decide, as a startup, as a company, like you're going to take on. It's aligned to your business outcomes. You're going to take on this jobs to be done. And so with the startup founder, we actually found a different job to be done that she could go after. And that drives, like, you can understand marketing around this. Like if you are a car company, how marketing can bring people into your shop. And then further in the interview, he talks about, the features of a car that were driving him to the specific car that he wanted. Like he wanted the smallest, cheapest car, but because he has this baby, he now needs a trunk to fit the baby. So if you center around this job to be done, then you start to understand how you can create a much better experience end to end for someone with this job to be done. So that's what I had, and we have 25 more minutes at least left.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, we want to have a discussion. Go ahead, Elaine.
I just have a quick question. Could we maybe take a moment to sort of play, maybe, I don't know if devil's advocate is the right word, but play a little bit with Brett's statement, and make some assumptions. Like, let's say they didn't have a car previously because parking was challenging. So like I'm just kind of filling in the blanks here with anecdotal data, but how would that factor in? Would that factor into any part of the analysis? Is there a place where you could put that bucket of information if it came up?
So if parking was challenging, that would be an anxiety. So if I'm switching to buy a car and have a car in this particular situation, then that's an anxiety of mine that's pushing me in the other direction to not buy a car. It's the habit of like the cultural thing I think that's happening. And like, I haven't had a car. I've survived without a car. It hasn't been that bad. and the anxiety of like if parking was the situation, that's an anxiety for why I wouldn't. And that, you know, might tip the scale of I'm not going to make change. Even though I want to, because I think that's a huge differentiator here is like people want to make change, so they'll tell you that this is what they want to do, and you're like, I'm going to build a product for that, but then nobody buys the product, and you're like, why isn't anybody buying my product?
Brett, thanks for posting the comments that you're making in the chat around the job and the anxieties. That's really nice, helpful context.
Yeah, there's definitely costs.
Along.
If you read the whole, if you listen to the whole interview, there's definitely costs at play there. And yeah, I love listening to the interviews. And there's other examples. I should probably build a list of them of like where they start pulling out the pushes and pulls. And I haven't found the power of this until I watched the interviews. I actually got to attend a Harvard class where Bob was and got to watch him in action. And like that was the aha moment for me, was watching the interviews, because it feels a little different than other types of interviews.
I got a question and then a comment. So I'll ask my question for you. When particularly talking about switch, right? And just that word switch, right? And I was wondering, it's all about change, isn't it? And I was wondering, isn't that a better like label than demand? Because you were talking about demand versus outcomes, right? Isn't it like change, or also use the word decision, right? It's like I have to change my decision or change my way. And I'm just wondering, like, it almost feels like a better way to frame Bob's approach is like it really understands motivations around change, right?
Yeah, I will tell you that I have two other collaborators on this type of approach. And I meet with Bob from time to time, but I have a hard time like describing the difference between them because there is such a difference, but like there's overlap. I think demand comes up because you know, traditionally when you're building products or whatever, many people are solution driven and you're like, here's my great solution. And like, I want to pull people and like pull them into the sales side, or the solution side, as opposed to the demand. Like, what are people actually struggling to do? And so I think that's where the demand comes. But I do think that his approach can sometimes get misunderstood because it feels too salesy. And that's why inside sales. And that's why I didn't really get into it as much until I watched it happen, because it goes beyond sales. And I think the key difference to me is like people have made a switch or made a change, and so it's important enough to them that you can understand the different forces at play. Whereas someone will just complain and you're like, oh, that's a big problem. And it's like, they're not going to do anything about it, so they're not going to buy your product.
Right. Yeah, good. Yeah, Brett had a comment there too about demand having a negative connotation, and switch or change, might be a better term there. And to be fair, sometimes people they talk about switch as that kind of flavor of jobs to be done. But here's my comment: if I zoom way out, if I zoom back out, right, one symptom that I've noticed with the companies that I've worked with or I've worked for is that they're not nearly as detailed and I don't want to say aggressive, but thorough in understanding their markets as they need to be, right? A lot of companies will put out a survey and say, hey, do you want this thing? Yes or no? Okay, that's demand generation data right there. And I think what we're saying with jobs to be done, whether you follow my approach or Ulwick's approach or Bob's approach or any other approach, is that understanding market needs takes a lot more investigation. And in fact, our friend David Duncan, who we had on the show, wrote a book that is a detective novel, right? And the thing I loved about the interview that you showed is that they're really saying, no, slow down. Can you repeat that again? Right? It's like a detective would do. And I think we need to be in our organizations, in order to be more customer centric, we have to be way, 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 way better detectives. And for me, what Jobs to be Done does, the big Jobs to be Done umbrella, is it gives us structured languages for being those detectives, right? And it was great. It's interesting you had that timeline there. I was thinking about that. And then you showed a timeline. Guess what detectives do? They put a timeline up on the board, and then they hang and you used the word clue, by the way. You said you got to interview. We'll go back on the recording, Elaine, and find that point where Beth used the word clue, right? And it's really just about, hey, we need to be way more specific and way more in depth about how we understand our customers. And Jobs to be Done gives us a way to be those detectives, but it gives us a way to do it with the structured language, right? Because you can't just say, hey, to your team or to your company, hey, go out and talk to people. Like, who are you going to talk to about what? And then more importantly, what are you going to do with those insights? Right. And if you just come back with a bunch of stuff, you're not going to be able to harmonize. And the great thing about Four Forces, for example, is it creates those buckets. And, Elaine just said parking, and you immediately categorized it in your mind to anxiety, right? And if you have that muscle where you can think about things in categories, you can as a team, you can be more detective-like and still have information that's more or less normalized. So I just wanted to make that observation because as you were talking, I thought about that bigger problem of not being specific enough and not being more like a detective. And for me, that's what ties the two to get perspectives together, really.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's like a time, the job map, the timeline, like those are all about the journey. I think there's definitely journey and there's definitely outcome oriented. I think the difference, is about like this is centered around people who have made some sort of change and made it a big enough struggle moment that they've made the change. And I think the other methods, like you're starting to feel that unmet need in terms of like what they want. And I think surveys have been used to like quantify it, but sometimes that can be for me, at least when I was using the framework, sometimes that can be harder to know like what will make them switch as opposed to interviewing like how did they make the switch. And what was interesting to me is like when you're a startup, you're like, well, I don't have a product. How do I have people? But when you think about what they're trying to achieve, that's who you want to interview, and they've made some kind of switch. So I think this interview is interesting with like the enterprise because he went to enterprise first before like he had a stopping over point of like, oh, this is a more convenient option, and then that wasn't cutting it. And so it's not just like yes or no, it's like this progressive change.
And change, there's that word again, change. You're talking about change, and it is about understanding human, because here's the thing, right? I don't know of any organization or business that at some point in time isn't dependent on understanding human behavior. As companies that provide services and products of some kind, so we have to know what do people want, what will people adopt, right? And that means we have to understand human behavior. And I find that a lot of commercial organizations in particular, also government, education for that matter too, are really, really bad at understanding human behavior as an organization. And this is what Jobs to be Done for me helps us do, is really understand in the context of our business the behavior that we're trying to understand and do it in a way that is, obviously behavioral science, any behavioral scientists on the call, they'll be like, no, we know how to understand behavior, right? But then it becomes this very academic type, there is behavioral science, but in a commercial setting, what is the quote unquote behavioral science? I think it's Jobs to be Done, right? And for me, whether you use Four Forces or Switch or Tony Olwick's method or our Canvas or anything like that, it's really, we're trying to understand human behavior as an organization, because ultimately our bottom line depends on that, right? The market will always decide on a company's success. I don't know any example where the market doesn't decide a company's success, right? There's always some customer or person in the equation.
Brett, I love your comment about, sorry, I love your energy and what you were saying, Jim. I completely agree. I was laughing at Brett's comment because,
go for it.
Yeah, I've been doing this for like almost 20 years, customer discovery. I've been doing Jobs to be Done for like 10-ish. It's so tempting. You're like, in your mind, you're like, oh, this will solve the problem. But yeah, it's the power to like, now that I've been doing it more, it's like, no, I want to solve for identifying what the Jobs to be Done is, because I've seen the impact that has made on the solution. But I used to go right to the solution.
Tell us more about that impact. Do you have any example there? How have you seen that impact? Because that's really where it comes down to.
Yeah, the one that I draw on, where I had the aha, and it was Tony Olwick's perspective. I had been doing customer discovery since 2006, and I was even at a startup within a larger organization, CEB. We were building a startup, but it was kind of related to the main company direction. And so I was doing customer discovery, but you were always kind of had customers to talk to. Like you had, the demand was kind of already there. And so you were constantly improving or maybe adding on. Like I was at Custom Ink and, we talked about like fundraising, and fundraising because it became a new business. You had your online t-shirts for family events and businesses, but then there was this whole fundraising aspect that we built out. And like that's a different job, but it's still related to this like core thing of what you're doing. So when I went to an ed tech startup, I was the first product hire at that ed tech startup. That's where I was like, all my techniques, like there's just this big wide world of what we can do, and we don't have any paying customers yet. And so that's where I got the Jobs to Be Done book. I went through it with teachers who are the end users and district administrators who are the buyers. And we mapped out their job maps, and I made it very collaborative with the organization because there were prior teachers, prior administrators there. And so we had, similar, Jim, to our little process we're doing tomorrow, we had hypotheses around what those job maps were and unmet needs. Then we went out and did interviews. We came back and we did do the survey. So the Tone has a survey where you can do the opportunity score. And it started to bubble up that both on the teacher side and the district administrator side, one of their biggest unmet needs was quick data to directly tied to the standards because they're so assessed on those state tests. And this is almost 10 years ago. So there's a lot of more tools out here now, but we were one of the first online only, like primarily online curriculum out there. And it got bought by Imagine Learning. It's now Imagine Learning, one of the top
Nice.
curriculum. We had a little luck where Open Ed resources came in at the same time, so we had like high quality curriculum. But the platform, we doubled down the product strategy on quick access to data, and made that super simple for the teacher based on standards. And then we rolled that up to the district administrators to help them understand which teachers needed support.
Right.
And so I think that was a big moment of like, okay,
Great.
it helps me narrow down because we could do teacher editing, we could do
right.
we could do, the world was way too large, and we were able to narrow it down really easily.
Well, that's the other thing I like to ask people. Does your organization lack ideas? Like you just don't know what to do. It's usually the opposite. It's usually there's so many ideas. The question is which ones we should focus on. And that's a really great story where it gave you the confidence to go forward with a couple of the dimensions that came out of that analysis. You should make a little case study of that. Maybe we can work together on that and post that as an impact story. I love it. Yeah.
I think Brett had another follow-up question. He raised his hand. Brett, are you there?
He's here.
Yeah, I dropped it in the chat. Basically, Beth, I'm kind of pivoting away from the substance, a little bit more esoteric. As you're working with folks, I noticed you use Miro in your presentation, which I love. I love it. I just would love to be able to use it now. Versus whiteboarding, you know what I mean? Very, very mechanical, in the room kind of stuff. So when do you find the electronic tool versus the whiteboarding tool to be more useful in that capture of information, the capture of these facts and conducting these interviews?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's pros and cons to each direction. I love a good workshop in a room. But post-COVID, like no one's in the same place anymore. Like I'm doing a workshop this Friday with an organization, and I would love to be in the room to do this workshop and like do the forces, but they're scattered all over. So I think there is like a logistical thing. I do love the tactile version of doing a whiteboard and doing the sticky notes. But I think the value of having it online is it's easier for everyone to like jump in and contribute. Like there's not spatial constraints in terms of like getting to the board, but also what's left behind. And so I take those boards, and like it's hard to, you're not going to take those and then present like the findings, but I have that as like a leave behind, pull that into like a spreadsheet that where I do more of like the analysis part of it with them. And so I think from a leave behind, because you used to get like photos of whiteboards, and then you're like, oh gosh, that's a very blurry photo. I don't even know what that post-it note says, and you have to convert them. Maybe there's an easy way to convert them with AI now, but I like the energy of in the room. But there's a lot of benefits to the digital once people understand how to use it. And I think it's becoming more and more common, but I still sometimes do a quick demo to get people used to whichever tool we're using, whether it's Mural or Miro. I've used them both.
Yeah, I found that the outputs of collaboration are always digital, right? You can collaborate on sticky notes in the room, which I love doing too, but eventually it has to go somewhere else, right? Spreadsheet or something like that. And I find thinking about that and using a digital whiteboard as a springboard from the offline to the online is very good too. And if you have a clear picture of sticky notes on the wall, you can ask AI to transcribe them. Try it. Take a photo of sticky notes, put it into ChatGPT, and it'll transcribe it. However, if there's shadows or overlap or things like that, it won't be able to read it. So the sticky notes really have to be like completely flat in order for that to work. But you can think about that. Yeah. So
I'm getting ready to have ChatGPT take a look at several whiteboards I've taken pictures of.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
ChatGPT crashes, you'll know that that my handwriting is stressed
Oh,
out.
that's you.
That'd be
The
me.
other
Just
day I couldn't log
I'm
on, Brett,
claiming
and I
it
was
now, just so you know.
cursing you out. I was like, hey, why can't I get into ChatGPT? Brett must be doing his image thing.
Now you know.
Now I know. Okay.
Um, I want to take a few minutes before the end of the meeting to ask Alexandra if she'd like to come up and comment on some of the things, the conversation in the chat. Alexandra was telling us that she's a cultural anthropologist with a background in
Ooh,
ethnography, and
nice.
that she's been using this like detective-like thinking approach with her team.
Awesome.
Yeah, I've been diving into jobs to be done, and the same thing, I have like so much confusion about which path to choose. So then I kind of go back to it's all about human behavior, and coming down to that. And what I've found kind of really valuable is uncovering those compensating behaviors. Because it's like it's the gap between what somebody says they do versus what they physically do, especially like much more on the innovative space, like and when you can do kind of the research in person. But I'm struggling with I would love some help or ideas. I'm struggling a little bit with teams where they already have a product, and now we're trying to almost like backtrack to like how can we put the jobs to be done framework to
Mhm.
work with whatever data we may have. I'm still new at the place that I'm working, and so I'm trying to fill these gaps as I transition into the more innovative space, but make it workable
Mm.
in current state. So I will take any feedback or help that people have.
Yeah. As it relates to this approach, and then Jim probably has a different, but as it relates to not different, but just like I think you can use either approach in this scenario. But when it comes to Bob Mess's like switch, I'm actually doing this approach for an acquisition. And so like they're trying to understand the other product. You can leverage current customers. So
Mhm.
current customers who have recently made a decision, like within the past 6 to 12 months, if there's like a big on-ramp to their decision, you might want it to be a little bit further away so you can get the full experience of like, did they get what they're trying to get? But you can leverage, you can not talk about jobs to be done, but talk about trying to understand, why people bought, why people churned, why people bought a competitor. And so having a handful of those stories, and that's where I like this approach for that type of scenario because you can, um, incorporate jobs to be done without saying you're using jobs to be done. You're just trying to understand why customers buy your product. But then I do think there's value in like a sustaining architecture that is more the Alwick, like of trying to
Mhm.
continue to improve the product. Because you have like, here's the map, here's what the unmet needs are, and like we can measure, like we continue to measure how we're doing on that. But I find that, at least from my perspective, can come like once they're a little bit more bought into jobs to be done as an approach and a theory.
Mhm.
Yeah, Jim, you might have different perspective
Yeah,
there.
no, not different, but maybe enhancer. Say things in a different way. Well, first of all, I just want to say I love ethnography, like well, commercial ethnography. I mean, I've obviously never done like real ethnography, but and it's still an approach that I think is valid and still useful. But what I found when I've done the more ethnographic type research is that it's it's less compatible with the typical business mindset. Let's just put it that way, right? So it's really hard to get the impact there. And the thing that I liked about Jobs to be Done was it took my sensibility from ethnography and contextual inquiry and methods like that that already exist, but it put things in a way that's far more palatable for the typical business mindset. So that was the thing that attracted me to Jobs to be Done was it took my human centered, person centered kind of sensibility and it gave me the tools to express it in terms that the people that were making decisions, if, could understand. But in terms of the two approaches, if we just, we use Beth's categorization of, Bob Mesta, demand side, or outcome from Tony Olwick over there. I've always said that demand side, or switch interviews and switch timeline, that's almost like reverse engineering, where you start with something that you currently have and you work backwards. That, because the timeline, if you look at switch interviews, the timeline is literally, it goes backwards. It says, okay, you made some decision to switch. Let's go back and look at all the time. And then from there, you can go forward into your solution, but in a way that's less biased, and you've already kind of stripped away the assumptions and you got down to the core job. Whereas what we teach at the Jobs to Be Done Toolkit, which is more of an Olwick approach, you kind of start from the job and work forward, right? So I've always said that switch interviews and four forces are great for a company that has a product and you want to take people along in that journey, because you can start from that product and reverse engineer, strip away the biases, get to the core job, and then move forward from there. That's how I characterize it. And I put a link in the chat of a piece that I wrote a while back. Doesn't quite use the term reverse engineering, I don't think, but that's how I think about the two different approaches.
Yeah, and coming at it from a different angle, if I am going back to the question too, because I think we go into like the different approaches, but the theory, I think if you start with the theory, and Clay Christensen is the one who popularized Jobs to Be Done, and I think it's because he connected the theory to the business in his competing against luck.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about the Milkshake story, like that, if you've read about that, like that started with observing and just standing outside the fast food restaurant, which I'm pretty sure was McDonald's.
It was, yeah.
Yeah, and so they were starting with like typical ethnographic research.
That's ethnography, yeah, right.
and so I think that is always interesting when you're leveraging that story too.
Mm-hmm.
And that book especially, I think, connects the dots and can help with the language of speaking to businesses about it too. And
I hope that helps, Alexandra.
It does. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Appreciate
sure.
it.
Can you tell Jim and I geeked out on this?
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, well, I was just about to say, this is a whole nother conversation. As we do here on Jobs to Be Done Untangled, that's what we do here, is we bring these conversations up and try to untangle as much as we can. So thanks everyone for contributing and for your questions and your thoughts. I hope this was valuable to you. But Beth, thanks to you for coming on and sharing your experience. It's great to have that, those real life stories that you can bring into it.
Yep. Awesome. Yeah, no, I'm excited for coming into these sessions moving forward, and lovely to meet you all. And thanks again, Jim, for the invite.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, everyone. We will be in touch with some
Feel
follow-up
free to reach out on
resources.
LinkedIn. I'm always happy to geek out. Bye.
Okay.